with the lesson, and it's interesting, we're walking through, we've got just kind of some random lessons in 1 Corinthians in these few weeks, and this is one that is familiar to us because it talks about, and Dick did a nice job of sharing in that message about being a servant. And this is one because Jesus came, right, not to be a servant kind of king. You know, Jesus came to serve others so that we could learn how we are to live. This is one of those key texts. Let's read this together from 1 Corinthians 9 and 19 through 23, where Paul writes, let's read it aloud together. It says, "For though I am free with respect to the law, I have made myself a servant to the law, so that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that I might by any means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I might share in its blessings." This is the word of the Lord according to Corinthians. And, as you might know, I was in Washington, D.C. last week, and I was reminded of a joke. This is, let me think if I can remember it. I was reminded of this joke that said, how many politicians does it take to screw in a light bulb? 2. It takes 1 to change the light bulb and 1 to change it back again. And I was reminded of that because I was in Washington, D.C. just in this past week, on the very same week that we had that State of the Union address. And it's just reminded of these political cycles. The pendulum swings one way and the pendulum swings yet back again. But we were there because we were on a conference. What an honor that we got invited to a conference. Our church is counted, believe it or not, in the 100 largest churches of our brand. So the senior pastors of those churches are invited to a conference in Washington, D.C., and that's what this was about. We were so busy. I got in and I had to go right to dinner. I had to go right to a conference. I had to get up. I had to go to a whole day of conferences. It's just meeting after meeting. I had 2 hours at the last. I hadn't been to Washington, D.C. in 40 years, 38 years. So, I decided I'd take that 2 hours and I walked the National Mall. I walked from the Washington Monument to the Capitol Building and back again. But again, the reason that we were there was not to see the sights, it was to have this conference. And we had some great talk about stewardship. I'm going to come back and bring some talk about stewardship, which is going to be helpful for a church like ours and connecting with colleagues. But one of the things that was most important is we got to meet with our new general minister and president, the Reverend Terry Hord Owens. In fact, the first African-American female executive of any denomination. And we got to meet with her in this, and we got to have a conversation and a dialogue with her in the time that we had together. And she didn't bring anything prepared to this dialogue. She used that time, which I thought was most appropriate, to talk with this constituency, with pastors of the largest churches, to hear what it was that we had to say. And a lot of what the conversation was pastors saying that they felt a disconnect between the priorities of that office and local congregations. I myself lifted a question. My question was this. I said, in your role as a pastor of a congregation where pastors and congregants are divided 50-50 over the political issues of the day, I said, in what case, what makes you decide, and at what times did you speak to these issues, and when do you remain silent on these issues? That was my question. I hope I articulated it better in the meeting than I just did, but I wanted to know. I said, you have a responsibility to the whole. And so, there's things that happen out there in the world. When do you speak? And when do you may remain silent? Because that's the burden that I have on me as a pastor. I thought I wanted to know how she made those decisions in her role as a pastor to the largest church, to the whole church. But because, when I was what I've learned as a pastor, I've learned that if I put my opinion on my sleeve in such a time as this, that I can alienate half of the people that I'm called to serve. And I've had to learn that through long experience, particularly, and I think these times are perhaps more heated, more divided than ever before. And I've determined that oftentimes the best choice for me is just to sit on my hands and to keep my mouth shut, because my opinion can get in the way of my ability to help somebody else. And I didn't always understand this. When I was a young pastor, I remember I would, I came out of seminary and I was just so full of my opinions. Joe, we knew each other back then. I think Joe and I kind of sat on opposite sides of some questions back then, and I was just so full of my opinion. I would say things from the pulpit, and I would watch my elders just squirm in their seats. Right? I remember I said one thing. A time I said something in my church in Tennessee, and one of our lead elders just got up and very deliberately stalked out down the center aisle. Just to make a point. They even had a meeting at one time where they wanted to censure me for using politics from the pulpit. You see, I was a young pastor. I was in my 20s, and I thought, these people, they just. They don't have the courage to hear the prophetic voice. I thought I was a prophet. Little did I know that I was 26 years old and I still had a lot that I needed to learn. And what I learned is that by leading with my opinion, that, I didn't have all the answers, right? But even more importantly, that opinion could get in the way of relationships. Right? And it's like my grandmother says, you've heard me say so often, that my grandmother says at 93 years old, she says, in the end, it's all about relationships. Right? And so God forbid that I let my opinions, that I let my politics, that I let my attitudes get in the way, be a barrier of me having a relationship with somebody else, and thus in having a relationship with God. Because what I've learned is that as much as we love our opinions, as much as we love our interpretations, that's not the end-all be-all, right? We can get so enamored of our opinions that can allow us to separate one from another. And I think that's what Paul was saying here when he says, I make myself a servant to all, right? Do you notice that he says, for although I am free with respect to all, I made myself a servant to all, so that I might win more of them. What is winning? I think winning is being in relationship, right? Just like what my grandmother says at the end. It's all about relationship. So if winning is about being in relationship, then God forbid that I allow my opinion to get in the way of that relationship. Right? But do you see what it is that he says? He says, for though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a servant to all. And I think that there's something there. I think that there's something about how when we're in relationship with a person, we've got to be careful about our motivations, don't we? Because there's a difference between serving people and pleasing people. Okay? I think oftentimes we're in relationship with people and we forget and we don't realize what our motivations. We come into a relationship with somebody and we think, well, what's in it for me? And those we're so savvy to those motivations, aren't we, in this world in which we live? We can tell when somebody has a motivation about, that's not out of love, but out of self-interest. There's a word for that. You call it codependency. You call it enabling. And this is oftentimes people will enter into relationships, and it might seem like somebody's being nice, but what is this really about? It becomes a cycle. Codependency is about somebody taking responsibility for somebody else's business so that they don't have to take responsibility for their own. There's a book, it's called Codependent No More by Melody Beattie. It's a famous book. Has everybody ever heard of that book? It's a famous book, Codependent No More. And she tells a story about an apple picking. And I think it's a great story because, so many stories about codependency or about difficult relationships or family systems or addictions. And this is a nice story about apples, but I think it tells the story, right? Because what she tells us, she says that a friend asked her to go apple picking with her. And she said initially she wanted to go. But she said when the time came, she was so busy that she postponed it and she put it off for another week. And she said she started thinking about it. She was begrudging the idea that she had to go apple picking. Well, the next week, she'd already put it off, and so she decided to go. But she said she'd already had it. This is what she said. She said, I've got a drawer full of apples. She said, I've got more apples than I know what to do with. I don't need apples. But she's driving to her friend's house, getting ready for this apple picking, and she says all the while she's seething with resentment about this. And she gets there, and her friend gets in the car, and they go apple picking, but she says neither of them says a word. She says it's not the joyful time that it could have been. She says she's just full of her anxiety and her tension, and she says they get there and they start to pick the apples and tasting the apples, and it's a beautiful day, but she says they're not finding, obviously they're not enjoying it. And finally her friend turns to her and she says, I don't even want to be here. She says, I'm just here because I thought that you wanted. You see? Her friend was feeling the same thing as what she was feeling. They were both of them doing it as a matter of obligation. This was a cycle, right, of codependency. They weren't helping each other. They weren't doing this with joy. It's kind of like I came out of this stewardship conference, and the guy says, we would rather have the person by himself with no contribution than who's happy than the person with a contribution who's got a frown on his face, right? Because what is this all about? This is about the condition of our heart. This is about us doing it with joy, right? God loves a cheerful giver. And so there's a difference. And so the point being here is we are to be a servant to all. We've got to do this with joy. We don't do it with obligation, because when we do it with obligation, we can actually get in God's way. Right? It's God who does the work, right? We can't do it for somebody. Right? That's something that can be the hardest part, can't it? We can't do it for somebody else. And so our attitude can get in the way of the work of God and the work of the Holy Spirit. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a servant to all, so I might win more of them. So we've got to learn to be free if we are going to effectively do the work, because we've got to allow God to be able to do this work. Otherwise, we are going to get in the way of the work that we're doing. I'll give you an example. I'm thinking about, I've told the story about how, and I've told this story a couple times. My wife says that I tell this story too often because she says it's really not that bad, but it's been something that I've been working on. Somebody came to me and asked, could I listen? And I said, and I sat down to listen, but instead, you remember, I said I diagnosed. And then that person walked away, and that was a step too far. That was something I had to pay attention to. I got in the way. God is going to do the work. I got in the way of doing the work. Or I think of another example on more of a macro. I was part of a church, and we were trying to resettle a group of refugees, and the refugees came out, and we worked so hard to get this group of refugees resettled. Right? We spent all these different months, and we found a place for them to live, and we found all the dry goods and all the things for them. We picked them up from the airport, and we moved all the things in, and we drove them to all their different appointments. And they were here 6 weeks, and then they decided that they'd had enough, and they up and moved to Minnesota. Right? And I heard about afterwards what this was about. After all this effort to get them resettled, and they couldn't be here for more than 6 weeks. They moved to a place that was colder and snowier than the place that they came. And I found out after the fact, what was this about? Well, one of our lead volunteers, was such a busybody that she was knocking on the door every day and coming in and telling them, you better clean up those orange peels. You better clean up those peanut shells. After 6 weeks, they'd had enough. You see, there's an example of somebody who, the point is that we're here to serve, but we can get in God's way. Again, there's a difference between pleasing people and serving. And the difference has to do with our motivation. So I'm thinking about this in a time, and I'm thinking about, this is what Paul is talking about when he's saying that, I am going to get my opinion out of the way. I'm going to be here so I can be here to be of service to people. To the Jews, I became a Jew. To those under the law, I became someone under the law. To those outside the law, I became. See, I'm getting out of the way so I can be of service to people. So the weak, I became weak so that I could be of service to people. I have become all things to all people so that I might by all means save some. But again, you've got to do it. We've got to do this with a freedom. We've got to do this because if we are attached to the outcome, then we can get in God's way. Now, one other story I'm thinking about on this time every year, this holiday, Groundhog's Day, I watch this movie. what movie do I watch over Groundhog Day these last few years? It's a movie with Bill Murray in it. Do you know what I'm talking about? The movie with Bill Murray is called Groundhog's Day. Has everybody seen that movie? Raise your hand if you haven't seen that movie. Raise your hand. Some of y'all haven't seen that movie. Well, I'll just tell you the story in the movie. He's a weatherman, right? He's a weatherman, and he wakes up every morning, and he is cursed to live this same day over and again in this little town, Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. Every day is Groundhog's Day. Every morning he wakes up to his alarm, and it's Groundhog's Day over and over again. Right? And he's a real grouch, isn't he? He's a real grouch to start. And he goes through this cycle in this time. And in the beginning, he's trying to figure out how he can get out of it, right? And then it's not long before he tries to figure out how he can make it work to his advantage, right? And then he thinks, well, maybe I can use all this time to pretend to make this woman to fall in love with me. You remember that? I'm going to do all these different things. I'm going to learn about her so she falls in love with me. And there's a great montage, isn't there? Where he's doing all these things. He's trying to get her to fall in love with her, learning all the different things that she likes. And she just, the montage, she just slaps him in the face again and again and again. He's working on this. And finally, she says, you are never going to love anybody but yourself. And that's when the change happened. Because the next day he wakes up and he goes about actually trying to invest in other people. Do you remember he sees somebody on the street and he gives them some change, and he starts, and his life turns around, and then finally, the next day he wakes up and it's February 3rd. You see, he learned the lesson. It took him a lifetime, Groundhog Day after Groundhog Day, to learn this lesson, but the lesson is you've got to get out of yourself. You see, and we've got that example. That's what Paul is trying to teach us here when he says, I do it for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. Because we're not doing it for other people, are we? We're doing it for ourselves. That's the secret. There's a spiritual truth that we've got to get out of ourselves. And you see, that's so important that we let go of any expectations that we have about that other person and what's going to happen. That other person's on God's journey, right? The principle of getting out of ourselves is for our own sakes. And I'll finish with one last story. This comes out of the Alcoholics Anonymous tradition, because the man who started the Alcoholics Anonymous, his name was Bill Wilson. And his whole principle was to go out and to try to be of service to others, and to get outside of themselves, to try to help other alcoholics that were struggling. And there was one snowy night that he was supposed to go down and help this guy down in a coffee shop, and he knew odds are that guy wasn't going to be there. So he was grumbling. Why did he have to put on his boots and go down and catch the subway to go down there? And thinking 50% that guy's not going to be there. And he was grumbling to his wife Lois. And this is what his wife Lois said. It's made into the history of the movement. And she said, but Bill, you're not doing it for him. You're doing it for you. You see, there's a principle there. There's a principle that we are to be all things to all people. Because we are to get out of ourselves, right? But we're not to attach ourselves to the outcome. Because when we're attaching ourselves to the outcome, then it's more about us than it is about them. When we're attaching ourselves to the outcome, then it's not following in God's way. It's doing that for our own purposes, for our own agendas. And the principle, just like what Paul did, is to get out of ourselves, to be of service to other people, so that we can find God in relationship. Remember, the Scripture says, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, then God is there. That's how we find God, in the other person, in relationship between one and another. God is here, present here in this very room. Thanks be to God this day.